Welcome to State of Ed, a podcast about education inside the classroom and out. My name is Marc.
And I'm Nick Simone.
How you doing today, Nick?
Oh, very, very excited for our episode today. How are you?
Also very, very excited. We have a friend of our podcast here, Dr. Tracey Benson, is with us. He's the co-author of Unconscious Bias in Schools, a developmental approach to exploring race and racism. And he's an assistant professor of educational leadership at UNC Charlotte. He received his EDLD at Harvard Graduate School of Education. That's in Massachusetts, Nick, in case you weren't aware. He held many roles in the world of education as a teacher, a vice principal, a PD specialist, a district leader. While at Harvard, he co-founded the Ethnic Studies course to provide a counter-narrative to traditional United States history. And it is an absolute pleasure to have him back on our podcast. Welcome, Dr. Tracey Benson.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Marc and Nick.
First of all, the conversation that we had back in March was really profoundly changed me as a person, as an educator. I know that a number of my colleagues who listen to the podcast, I mean, we had amazing conversations about the chat that we had, and they're completely inspired by the work that you and Sarah Fireman, your co-author, have done with that book and continue to do. I know you've done a lot of talks on the book, and you continue to try to get the word out there and share these strategies and this way of thinking, which is so critical, especially with what's going on in our country and our world today. And so there is so much that we want to discuss with you, because the world, almost like the minute we turned off the microphones, the world changed dramatically. We're at this major inflection point in our country's history, arguably world history. The best place for us to begin is the murder of George Floyd and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. So my question for you, because a lot of schools were shut down by the time that occurred in May, what do you think schools would have been like had they been in session at that time?
Well, I think that some schools would have handled it in a way that they handled it before. They would have talked about the shooting of George Floyd. They would have talked about the civil unrest that was happening. They would have talked about racial strife in our country. But, unfortunately, that's a minority percentage of schools. Most schools would have done just like they've always done in the past with the shooter Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, just remained school as usual. And unfortunately, like in our school buildings, teachers and principals often don't have the racial literacy to really understand how to talk about the dynamics of race and racism. So while I would love to think that school being a place of learning would be one where we engage in conversation about what's going on in broader society, especially when it comes to issues of race and racism, I do think right now we're still at a stage where, talking about race is taboo in schools. Micah Pollock writes a book called Color Mute. And what basically her book is about, it's about how schools and in general society, we hold to this ethos about not talking about race and racism. So much so that we become racially illiterate, and that it becomes more difficult for us to talk about race as we grow older. And so what I do wish for schools is that we would use these opportunities to talk about the dynamics of race in our society, and how, we can teach students that it's not taboo to talk about racism, what's going on currently. But I don't think we're at that point quite yet. And I think if schools were in session during the uprisings after the murder of George Floyd, I think we might have done, maybe I would like to hope we would have done a better job at talking about it. But I do know that schools are still a place where we have trouble talking about race and racism. So I hope that we can do better.
Well, I could speak from my experience because I was teaching 11th and 12th graders at the time, and it was a very, very difficult time because they wanted to be in school, having these discussions. We were teaching remotely, so there was some opportunity to do that in a virtual platform. But the way I approached it is I allowed people to speak separately. We had like separate Google Meets outside of class if they felt that they just needed to, ask questions, cry, deal with it any way they could. And then many of them chose to do their final projects on the movement. And I can maybe, some of the work they did would really, it was just very moving, really inspirational of what they did. I think it gave them an outlet rather than, punishing them with some final project on, the presidency of Andrew Jackson, that has no relevance to their life. they felt so good about being able to express their views. One girl wrote a poem about it that I just thought was phenomenal. So, but it was difficult not being in class. There's no question about it.
I see almost like two different sides of this coin. One is what you and Nick were just describing in terms of the students being there. Had they had the opportunity to be in school in person, they would have had the opportunity to be there, to have these conversations, to be supportive of one another, to cry on one another's shoulders and express how they feel and everything else. But then there's the other side, and this is also what I was sort of intimating with my question. What about the students who, just to spark controversy, come in with their, Blue Lives Matter shirt or their Make America Great Again hat, and doing that intentionally to stoke the fires of whatever it is that whatever they wish to create, whatever disruption they wish to create. So that's the other side of it, and I wanted to get your take. How do you think that may have, potentially played out? Because I do think that we, as educators, while we on one hand lost a great opportunity to be there and have those conversations with our students and support those kinds of conversations that you're discussing, there's also a part that almost in a way lucked out, because we didn't have to also deal with the dark underside of those who wish to take advantage of this opportunity to kind of stoke additional controversy or to create, problems, essentially, just to put it bluntly.
Well, I think schools are a place for civil discourse, and that students, regardless of where they lie on the political spectrum, whether they're coming in to be, a disruptor of, sort of the left-leaning Black Lives Matter and more humanitarian view, if they're coming in to provide the counterpoint to them, I think schools are the one place we should be able to have the civil discourse. The reason that we're so polarized in society is because folks from across the aisle simply can't talk. If you have a Trump flag flying outside of your house and you're a promoter and you're a supporter of the NRA and, whatever else may be, and then, across the street you have someone who's pro-choice and the antithesis to what they see across the street, doesn't mean we all shouldn't be able to come together and have civil discourse. Like, we might not agree, but we need to come closer in terms of understanding each other's perspectives. Because what's happened in society and what we see in schools when we talk about these dissenters who come in to cause trouble, we're demonizing someone's perspective. These perspectives has come from somewhere. Whether these students have been influenced by their parents, their extended family, whatever the case may be, they're coming into schools to make a statement by what they're wearing, what they're saying, build the wall, make America great again. Yeah, these are all sayings that exist in society that promote division. Now, the only way that we're going to actually come together as a society is allow for these children to have civil discourse within the schoolhouse and not see ourselves as the arbiters of what is right and wrong. And I think that's the largest problem that we have right now, is that we don't have the dynamics within the school building to discuss how people see things differently, and without calling the other side wrong or ignorant or dumb, but a place where we can respect all opinions in a way, and we can agree to disagree, so that once these students grow up and they're in society, we don't have such divisions. You at least understand those who have a different political belief, different religious belief, different sexual orientation belief than you do. Understand them enough to still see them as your neighbors, but not demonize their views and the way in which they see America. And I think that's the only way we begin to heal the divides that we have in our society right now.
See, this is why I think you should be in charge of education. I said it before, because you're all about finding solutions. You're all about, you don't want to make people feel guilty or feel, or just, you want us to come together. You want society to be a better place. And you're right, school is the place where that can take place. I've never met anybody who's as, so well informed about you and so passionate about your views, and yet you want us to come together. But you're right, school is the place where that should be taking place.
So let me put you on the spot then. So now imagine you're back in your school as the principal, and you're in this particular moment in time. What's the first thing that you do to even start to prepare your teachers to have the mindset or take the approach to having these kinds of conversations and to creating or opening up school to be the beacon of discourse that you're describing?
Well, me now is definitely a lot different than me of 20. When did I become principal? 2010. And so this is 11 years ago. And so since then, I've gone back and got my doctorate. I've been in the realm of doing work on structural racism and really deepening my racial literacy. But me back at 32, when I first became a principal, if I could put myself back then with this same thing going on right now back then, I would do just what I did then. I relied on outside support. I sought out an organization called Multicultural Bridge, led by Gwendolyn Van Sant, and they did work specifically around racial equity, racism, and bringing folks together. And so this is what I think principals should do all over the U.S. is that if they feel that they want to be the change they want to see in the rest of the world, and they want to start at their school level, one, you can try to take it on slowly on your own, but I also recommend these folks reach out to specialists. I'm currently a specialist in the field on having conversations about race and racism and addressing the vestiges of that within the school building, opening up discussion, having people become more comfortable with discomfort, actually looking for where racial bias and racism shows up in the school building, and developing mitigating practices to undo these vestiges within the school building, all the while building the racial literacy of principals and teachers to talk about the important dynamics of racism and how we need to help students become more comfortable with having these conversations. And so for me as a principal, if I'm back, in my building, I'm definitely relying on a specialist, because a lot of us have good intentions. We really want to help our teachers and our students and ourselves have these conversations. But we also have to remind ourselves that we have very low racial literacy because this very same system, the school systems that we've gone through, have made us functionally racially illiterate. The same dynamic we see in terms of our inability to talk about race in the school building is the same dynamic that we went through, hence we have a tough time talking about it. And so I highly recommend individuals within school buildings relying on outside specialists, putting time, money, and energy, and investing in a long-term relationship with the specialist so we can make our school buildings more a more conducive place to discuss political divisions, to discuss dynamics of race and dynamics of racism.
You see, when I listen to you say that, first of all, I could listen to it all day long. But for me, I think about we're limited with time. So in terms of devoting, like how you devote time to this cause, in my mind, I'm saying, imagine if we took away all of the time we devote to test preparation, all of the effort and money we put into just test prep for kids that I don't know how you feel, but I don't think has as much value for their future lives. And if we put all that time into this cause, how much better off would we be as a society?
You're right. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more that we put our time, money, and energy towards things that we deem important. And so right now we're in this heavy testing environment, which really hasn't yielded a lot of results, like as it said it would have. With high stakes testing, we don't see these rapid improvements in schools. What we do see is an opening of the privatizations of schools and schoolhouses, which really, again, hasn't yielded any substantive gains in achievement for any population. And so, now that we realize that it really hasn't yielded the same sort of things that we envisioned in the beginning with any academic who studies academic achievement would have been able to tell you, that we now have to shift to, like, what does our society need? What do we need to bring ourselves together and really make us a stronger society? And if we deem that, healing our political divisions and really reconciling with race and racism is essential to our country's well-being, then we'll put our time, money, energy, and resources towards preparing our students to be a better generation than we've been.
I have to share a story with you, Tracey. So I had a conversation recently because I've been trying to have, in my own world, in my own way, develop a culture of bravery, which is something that you talk about in your book and something that we talked about in our last conversation. And just as evidence of how transformative that conversation and reading your book has been in my life. So I had a conversation with someone that I work with, and the topic of white privilege came up. Now, just a little, I'm not going to divulge too much, but this is an older gentleman, very traditional, conservative, old world European mindset. Hopefully I'm painting a clear enough picture. Concept of white privilege came up, and he immediately rejected the notion of white privilege because he's salt of the earth. He built everything with his own two hands. He created his opportunities and so on and so forth. And I told him that I respect all that, and that's phenomenal. I said, so you weren't a child of privilege, meaning that your parents didn't give you things, you had to work for those things and so on. I said, but let me try to explain the difference between privilege and white privilege based on my new understanding, because I'm trying to constantly develop and further my understanding of everything, especially in a reflective way. So I gave this example, and hopefully you'll be proud of me. I was proud of myself, and so don't if it's bad, just let me down easy so you don't crush me. He was talking about how proud he was of his son. His son just is an adult, and he's kind of entering into the workforce, and he just got a job at a relatively small accounting firm. And so I started kind of dancing around the edges. I said, now, how many of the executives in this firm are white? What percentage? Of course, he said 100%. I said, okay. Which is okay. That is what it is. I said, let me try to explain something. When your son sat in the waiting room when he was going in for his interview, is it fair to say that he was nervous? And he says, of course. I said, is it fair to say that he was perhaps nervous that they would ask him a question that he couldn't answer? Yes. Is it possible that he was worried that they would think he doesn't have enough experience? After all, he's only 22 or 23. Yes, of course. Is it possible that they would have somebody else in mind for the job and then he wouldn't get it? Was he worried about that potentially? I said, yeah. I said, did it ever once, for even a split second, cross his mind that he might not get this job because he's white? And he said, no. And I said, that is white privilege. A form of, or an example of white privilege. So I was very proud of myself, and I said, I have to share that with Tracey one day, because I thought I totally hit a home run with that one. So I'm hoping that you agree, but if you don't, just, let me down gently. That's all I ask.
Well, thank you for sharing that story, Marc. I mean, that's interesting, and yes, I'm very proud of you for attempting to help someone raise their racial literacy. So for this gentleman that you were describing, I can actually picture him in my head. Probably has never talked about the concept of white privilege. Hasn't really had many conversations growing up about dynamics of race and racism. Really doesn't understand how it affects people and how he embodies what is white privilege. And I think part of having these conversations with others is, one, to see them as we see us, right? So this gentleman probably has a very low level of racial literacy and has a very low level of comfort in some aspects, because that's why he instantly rejected it. And we don't need to see him as a dissenter, but someone who just sincerely doesn't understand and is feeling very, 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 very uncomfortable. So when people have a very low level of racial comfort, they get offended or feel anxiety very, very easily, and then they reject, close down, don't want to engage. But by you pushing forward and trying to create an analogy for helping him understand the dynamics of white privilege, this is sort of the pinprick in his veneer of misunderstanding about the dynamics of race and racism. This gentleman is not a bad person. He just doesn't have the racial literacy. And so what we talk about in our book is that we're trying to break down this dynamic of the good non-racist, bad racist. This binary that we have, it's as if someone doesn't understand the dynamics of racism, denies racism, is what we would call a white supremacist. We want to see these people not so much as dissenters, but people who are very, very early on in their racial literacy, who truly do not understand the dynamics of race and racism, and also have a very low threshold for discomfort. And so it is our job to have conversations with these individuals, not to bring them where we are, because we no longer have the answers. But our job is to have a dynamic conversation so that we can build empathy for one another, right? Because we have to understand, folks who've had privilege, a lifetime of privilege, and that are now seeing, equality come. When you've had privilege, equality now feels like oppression. When you're being told and you're being explained that you've had privilege, it's hard to really digest that, because it really probably eats at your self-esteem in a way that you didn't just make it here because of your smarts or your hard work, but you actually have privilege because of white skin. And so the conversation you have with this gentleman is pushing him along his continuum in terms of racial literacy. And, you need to keep coming back and having more conversations, because this can't just be the only one. Right? And you need to have it in a way that you're pushing this man to his, the center, the second circle in the zone of proximal development, Vygotsky, in the center of the circle is, things that you can do on your own. Second layer of the circle is the things you can do with help. And the third layer are things you can't do, right? We got to keep folks in that sort of that's middle layer, like things you can do with help, right? And in order not to scare them into the outer layer, outer layer of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development where they stop learning. They get defensive and they disengage. So it sounds like you kept him. You didn't keep him just in the comfort space, but you pushed his thinking. And so I think, you need to go back and continue to have these conversations. And so, one, you can help him, but also, two, you can develop a level of empathy to understand where he's coming from and also learn from where he is at. So then we can bridge these divisions instead of seeing each other at poles that we don't know enough or we have to teach each other things. But we're having these conversations for the betterment of both of us who are engaged in these conversations.
That's brilliant. By the way, you could talk for another 10 hours, but you've already hit the jackpot for Nick because you mentioned Vygotsky. And so, I will tell you that it is all downhill from here, but that's okay. It can't get any better than that.
There's a long side story to that, which we won't share
We're
now.
not going to bore you with that.
But the very, very quick version is I just learned about Vygotsky in my doctoral program. I'd never learned about his views before, a couple of years ago.
Yes,
but you're the first person I've ever met who's referenced Vygotsky that, seamlessly. You just said it, how you did that in a discussion on, racial unrest and racism is remarkable. Great work. Tracey, how much importance do you place on people becoming educated about past events, policies? I was very, I guess I would say impressed, but so many people who learned about, the Tulsa massacre and Black Wall Street for the first time this year. Now, I'll admit, I didn't know this in high school. I was never taught about it. I was never taught about it in college. I only learned it a few years into my teaching career. But a lot of people come up to me and say, I feel like I'm a pretty well-educated person. I've never heard about this before. And then I learned I never knew about the Wilmington insurrection in 18. I never knew that until, a couple months ago. So I'll be teaching it for the first time this year. But how important do you think it is for people to actually be educated about the past, clearly racist policies and acts to help them today?
Well, I thank you for that question. I think it's absolutely important because we often like to sort of erase history, in terms of just the ugliness of the history of our country in terms of racism, oppression, rape, murder of Black people, and Native Americans. That this is a really, very real part of our foundings and how we were as a country and how the residuals are the reason we are where we are today. So when we talk about the achievement gap or the gap in historical wealth or the gap in healthcare outcomes, the gap in employment, these are all residuals from our racist history, And we have to remember that, last year was 2019. That's the 400th year of the transatlantic slave trade. And why is that important to remember? The 1619 Project is very important to pocket us at this time in history. Because what we know is that from 1619 until 1865, Blacks were enslaved in this country. That's 246 years. Folks forget that. That for the better part of 400 years that Blacks have been here, we've been enslaved for more than half of that time. And then even after that, for another 99 years, there was Jim Crow segregation, where Blacks were purposefully subjugated and separate from white society, and we were not allowed, quality schooling, quality access to healthcare. We were kept in our segregated communities and housing. We weren't given really high-level jobs, minimum wage and things of that sort, really high levels of unemployment for another 99 years. So if you take the 246 years of slavery plus 99 years, that's 345 years of oppression of Black people out of 400 years, right? And so if you take 1965 as the outline, the official, the Civil Rights Movement, as the Civil Rights Act, as the official outline of legalized subjugation of Black and brown people, so 1965 up until 2020, how long is that? That's 55 years. Compared to 345 years of legalized oppression. So we have a little ways to go. Now, these residuals are still here. They're still living with us. The residuals of the mindset that Blacks are less than is still alive and well here. We don't have historical wealth in the Black community because we've been subjugated for so long. We've been denied our rightful wages, our rightful land, our right to learn, and high-quality schooling, and all these things for 345 years. And outside of that, and then from 65 on, it's only been 55 years. And so we have a lot of work to do to undo the wrongs. And we see the residuals that are showing up today in all those measures that I mentioned before in terms of health, employment, and in education. These are residuals of the mentality and the structure. And so we have some undoing to do. And I think as folks really understand the length of time the blacks were subjugated here, and then how that directly links to where we are today, I think people might be a little bit more willing to do the equal and opposite response in order to get us to sort of solve for historical wrongs, to bring us to a place where we're actually all an equal playing field.
I love the notion of threshold, because and how people are just, they're not there yet. They don't have, like you said, they don't have the literacy. They're not ready to have those conversations. They're not armed with any sort of preparation, because frankly they've never had to. What experience would they even call upon to even begin to take the first step down that journey? And when they take that first step, it immediately makes them feel uncomfortable, so they retreat, and then that's that.
I agree. I mean, it's on both sides too, right? So, I think, we're of like ilk, Marc and Nick, that we believe in this, the need to talk about sort of what the popular, political media is called the left media. I mean, the left-leaning folks, which is just, it's humanitarian cause. Like, racism is humanitarian, but it's become political. We politicized it, right? And so when you talk with folks across the aisle, we're so wedded to our ways of seeing things that we want to demonize the other side. And so when we're talking about people such as the Proud Boys, right, we want to put them as, oh, they're evil, irredeemable racists. Look at the racism over there. Now, what if we were to build empathy for these people? Like, wow, is a black man who studies race talk about building empathy for the Proud Boys? Yes, I am. Because the only way that we're going to get to the point where we're going to talk with folks like the Proud Boys is to bring us together to see where we meet, we have mutual agreement. It might not be on your political views, but we have to understand, at least from my side, is that folks who come from this hateful rhetoric, they're experiencing a sense of loss. I think that's the essential feeling, as these folks are really feeling that I have lost something. And we all have that general sense in some aspect of our life of what it means to lose, to experience loss. And so while it's the Proud Boys who are saying, either make America great again or whatever their rhetoric is, if you break it down to the essential, they feel like they've lost part of America that they used to recognize. Now, I'm not saying that we need to go back to that, but we can all, empathize with that feeling and see where that emotion comes from, then hopefully build a bridge to talk about, okay, how can we move forward together instead of you staying over there, me staying over here, and I think you're wrong and you think I'm wrong. We have to put our both ourselves in a place where we're both mutually uncomfortable with talking about each different views, so that we can, get more comfortable with that discomfort and hopefully maybe not agree, but agree to disagree, but still respect the other person who's come to the table to have these difficult conversations.
Just to jump back to what you were saying before, talk about the sense of loss, and that's so profound the way you phrase that. As someone who's Jewish and very much painfully aware of the history of my ancestors, I can't help but when I see videos of Proud Boys and listen to the rhetoric of the leader, I can't help but think of like the brown shirts in Germany. I mean, it's that call for violence to resolve everything, that there is no answer other than violence. That gives me a lot of pause and a lot of trepidation about. I want to be an optimist. I truly do. I'm an optimist at heart, but it's hard when you see ingredients and other ingredients entering into the equation. And if you are, if you understand your history and you understand and you have the ability to analyze what's going on in the moment, it's hard to look at the accumulation of ingredients and not equate it to where you've seen those ingredients at play before. And that gives me a tremendous amount of concern for our country and what the upcoming weeks and months will bring for our nation, and the inflection point that we're currently at, I believe, in our nation's history, and how people will respond no matter which way the election goes, how they'll respond outside of our schools, how will our teachers and students will respond inside of our schools. So it's very disquieting. I have a very uneasy feeling coming back this year, just knowing what's to come. And I want to remain incredibly optimistic, but I also don't want to be foolishly optimistic or naive.
I agree with everything you said. I'm probably more optimistic than maybe most people. I feel like we could be closer together on so many of the issues. if we had the type of leadership that wanted to bring us closer together, to solve problems in the country. But we can't do that if we're still going to let, the extreme hatred have like a podium, and have a voice. Those groups, I respect how you're saying we want to listen to them and have discourse. I get that, but there's no place for it. And I do think young people feel that way. I could not believe how many of my students were deeply upset. And they said it in class. They said, I can't believe that the president wouldn't disavow white nationalists at that debate. And they were really upset about it. And Tracey, I didn't even know how to handle that. I didn't even know. I just gave them the forum to speak, and I didn't even know how you respond to a 16-year-old kid who couldn't believe that's what she heard.
I think a lot of us see sort of this recipe for disaster right now in our country. Is like, how did we get here, And I see it as a way that we reap what we sow. America has always been this. We've always been this, what we're seeing right now in terms of giving a platform and a voice to those who sow hate in society, what we see as hate. And so, Donald Trump didn't make America. America made Donald Trump. And I think that because we're at a moment where we really need to reconcile with who we are as a country. This is a sort of a wrestle for the soul of America right now. Because for a number of years, Obama, even pre-Obama, like we were lulled to sleep. And I heard this more than enough times that folks are like, we're in a post-racial America. We're in this sort of this time where we're all getting along, where we're all together. That was never the case. And most black folks knew it wasn't the case, but a lot of white folks thought that we were there. And these sort of white folks same white people were so disappointed when Donald Trump got elected, where you ask someone like me and my family, like, you know what, this is America. This is America. This is America that we've always known, as a person of color, as a black American, that this is what we've seen and what we've experienced. And so now we're having a discussion on a national level among not just black and brown people, but among everybody. We have to decide where we're going as a country. Where are we going in terms of acceptance, in terms of exclusion, in terms of our place in the world, our place in terms of understanding systemic racism, where we are in terms of abortion rights. And so we have to determine where we are. So this is one, we see the ingredients and what we built and what we're at right now. But I think we're reaping what we're sowing. We thought that we were at a place that we weren't. And so this reckoning we're having right now is what we deserve and what we need. Because without this, we can't be lulled to sleep again by some left-leaning president that just sweeps it under the rug. Doesn't make the problem go away. Now we're having to reconcile and actually have those conversations, which I think that is deeply needed. And if our president gets elected again, we're going to have to go through 4 more years because this is what we've done and this is what we've asked for. By purposefully thinking that we're not at a place where we are currently. And so, with the upcoming election, this is where we're at. And we've had this reckoning, and the reckoning has been long coming. And not to say that the conversation's over. If this president doesn't get elected, it needs to continue to decide where we go next. But again, we've had hundreds of years of legalized oppression in this country. We have a very, very, in terms of we only had decades opposed to centuries. And so we continue needing to reconcile with this idea that we're at a place where we have arrived when we're not. And as far as the president not disavowing white supremacists, yeah, it's a problem, But the question is who is then the next call for him to then speak up against? It's a slippery slope. Yes, white supremacy is, in terms of the hateful form of it and doing harm, is not good for our country. And instead of pushing them to the side and say that we don't agree with their views, we need to say, all right, we have these individuals, they are members of our country. How do we have these conversations so we can all come together and have a national conversation about who we are as a country? Because we're in our bubble in America. In some countries, especially, if I'm thinking some countries that I go to, I believe in same-sex marriage. I believe in legalized abortion. I believe in you could choose any religion you want. In some countries, I'd be considered to be extremist. Some countries, they're so strict in terms of their beliefs that I'd be the extremist. And I'd be the one that then, okay, president, that you have to point there and say, these are the people we don't want here. So we're asking us to do that in this country. I don't believe that's the way, because you don't, solve the problem with white extremists by condemning them and pushing them over there. You solve the problem by talking about the issues that they're concerned about, and then bringing us to a place where we can have these conversations so we can reduce the hate by conversation, by humanizing everybody.
What's your reaction to how professional sports, in particular the NBA, are handling the Black Lives Matter movement?
I think it's great. I mean, I didn't see us here a season ago, right? When Colin Kaepernick first took his knee, or when he sat first, actually, and then he took his knee, and the way that the whole country got up in an uproar about disrespecting the flag, and the president spoke out about it, and then he got blacklisted, and then he couldn't play football. Like that was only, I think it was 2 years ago. It was fairly recent that all this happened. And so from then up until now, I think one, Kaepernick feels vindicated. And two, this is an issue that he first brought to light and said the professional athletes, and again, he's not the first one. There were other players before him, back in the 90s and 80s. But he's the most contemporary one to say this is an issue we need to pay attention to. And I think without him doing it before it wasn't popular, we don't have where we see the NBA at right now. And so the NBA, in terms of putting Black Lives Matter on the court, putting the names of different sayings on the back of their jerseys, I believe, one, it brings more recognition that this is a national issue. Not to say that it changes mind, but it's more exposure for basketball fans at least. But two, it's been corporatized too. And so, yes, it's a move in the right direction. And what I want to see next is how it continues. This can't just be a flash in the pan until this gets quiet again. It needs to be something the NBA continues to be involved in, putting their money and energy towards anti-racism efforts, which one of them is that, a lot of the owners are opening up their stadiums as voting polls. And I think that's awesome. That's a step. That's an actual tangible step to increase the accessibility to voting. Now, what else can they do? What else should they do to solve the issue with police brutality in particular? And so I'm waiting to see how this continues and what their public platform is going to be for the next 5, 10, 15 years.
Speaking of, being locked up in COVID, everybody was watching the Michael Jordan documentary, and there were some parts there about him not being, wanting to alienate people for sneaker sales. And LeBron has not been that way.
I mean, yeah, and I think LeBron and all the other players, because LeBron wasn't the first. He was again one of many who stepped forward, and he's the most well-known and well-recognized name. But he chose to take an upper leadership position in the movement of the NBA to support the Black Lives Matter cause. And as far as Michael Jordan goes, I think he was in a different political time. I think during a national reckoning on racism, a global reckoning on racism, there's a little bit more political will to get behind, big stars who want to take up the cause. That wasn't the case back in the 80s and 90s, when Jordan was playing. And so I believe he would have been taking a real professional risk and putting himself out there, a lot like Colin Kaepernick did before there was this national and global reckoning on racism. And so I'm sure, being a black man, being a black superstar that he had, and being from Chicago too, that he had a certain level of racial awareness, but I think he was politically and professionally savvy enough to do what he could in terms of his position without putting himself at risk, because it wasn't as it wasn't a national conversation back then.
You're making me think of did you see, I hope I get the name right, Kimberly Jones, the activist that when the protests were going on in Minneapolis, and she was screaming, and she said, just be happy that all black people, I'm going to get it wrong now, she says, just be happy that that black people are only looking for equality and not revenge. Did you see that?
Oh, that was outside, was it Target or something?
Yeah.
That had burned down?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, she was extraordinary, and then she kind of made the circuit from that way. But I think that's, so when I'm listening to you, put it all into the historical context, you stop in 64, 65 with, that's legislation, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. And we probably got, I mean, we weren't around for then, but we probably got this feeling like complacency, right? Okay, we passed legislation, everything's good now, and we move on. Do you think we need more legislation? Do you think we need more societal change, or is it a combination of both?
I believe we need an equal and opposite response. Right. So for the 246 years where black folks were denied access to healthcare, access to generational wealth, access to education, access to dutiful employment, we need an equal and opposite response, because this is a century and a half of oppression just in the time of slavery, not to mention stem cell segregation. So there needs to be an equal and opposite response to make up for the centuries of oppression that we put Black folks under in this country. So I do believe we need a lot more legislation towards what does that look like in terms of wealth, in terms of access to quality healthcare, in terms of access to education. You can't just level the playing field and be like, all right, we're cool. We have everything's equal now. That is not the way. That is not an equal and opposite response. And so I think we need a lot more attention to what does it look like to truly level the playing field. And another thing we have to think about is those who, run our country. It's been white, male, heterosexual, able-bodied, wealthy males for as far back as we can remember who've run our country. In the Senate, in the House, most governors, most mayors are white males. And white males, there are actually more women in our country than there are males. And so white males having such a distinct advantage in terms of making legislation and making decisions in our country is inherently unfair. And so we have to think about what does it look like to have a more equal representation at every level of government so that people can be included in terms of how we run our country. So I think that is where we can see ourselves having made it, that it's not just, this sea of white men making these decisions in government, that it's a whole plethora of different races and genders who are making the decision and being elected and actually bringing perspectives from different identities to the table to really change our legislation that really fits everybody and doesn't just benefit the white males of society, or doesn't come just from their perspective on how our society should run.
I wish I could just memorize everything that you just said. So maybe he shouldn't be in charge of education. Maybe he should be in charge of the whole thing, Nick. Don't you think? That would be just why we'd be wasting his time with just giving him only one thing to work on. He should be working on all the things.
I know how modest and humble he is, but Tracey, you are an extraordinary, human and a great leader, and anybody that comes in contact with you is a better person because of that experience. And your students must be so, privileged and blessed to have you in front of them in the classroom.
Well, Marc and Nick, it's been a wonderful, time chatting with you for my second time. And you two are very humble yourselves. I always enjoy coming on your show and having conversation with you because you two think very deeply about, issues, especially the issues of race. And I appreciate your openness and your willingness to engage in this country. You have two white men and a black man having a discussion about race. This is an example of what it could be. Having discussions across racial lines about the dynamics of race. And so I really applaud you for using your platform and inviting me on your show to have these really deep discussions. So, I applaud you for what you do and really appreciate your time and your willingness to have these discussions.
If you don't mind, can I ask you one more question, like a more personal question? And if you don't have an answer, don't worry. Is there one person in your life and your upbringing that had the most significant impact on like who you've become as a person? Is there anybody that really shaped, your trajectory and growth and maturity as a person?
There is, and I'm not sure he knows this. His name is David Lyons, and David was my principal internship supervisor. So back in 2006, I believe, I was in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, in my second year of it's 2005, of my master's program at UNC Chapel Hill. And my internship placement was at Smith Middle School. And my direct supervisor was David Lyons. And he was the assistant principal at Smith Middle School. And he'd been a principal for a long time in Durham. And he'd moved into an assistant principalship to ride out the rest of his career. And he was super influential because he was a very powerful presence in that building. A powerful presence in terms of he was very approachable. He was very empathetic towards all students and all teachers. He was a leader in that he didn't lead by dictating. He led by, bringing folks together and hearing different perspectives. And he never got rattled. He was always even keel. And I rarely saw him get to a point where he was utterly frustrated or angry or mad or upset. And he had this ethos and air about him that was confident that, not that he knew what was right, but confident that he had the ability to bring folks together. And since then, I've really tried to model myself. And our temperaments are a little bit different, right? I tend to move faster, think in different ways, and a little bit more quick-triggered, when it comes to making decisions. But I really try to pull myself back and really embody his level of leadership. Because I think he's someone that brings folks together. And when I talk about, not putting folks in spaces where we cannot agree, you're over here and I'm right and you're wrong, he was the embodiment of that. And so I really appreciated his style, and I was only with him for 1 year, and I haven't actually seen him since. But he had a profound impact on who I was as a school leader, who I am as a researcher, and who I am right now as someone who pushes for racial equity in society.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that.
Amazing. Well, thank you really so much. This is a pleasure to have you, and this was even more enlightening than our first conversation, and I thought it wouldn't get better than that, but I was wrong. We could talk to you forever, but I know that we've dominated way too much of your time already this evening, but we really, really appreciate it. Just a couple of little notes here at the end. Of course, if you'd like to catch back episodes, including our original conversation with Dr. Benson, you can find us at stateofedpodcast.com. And you can also pick up Dr. Benson's book, which is Unconscious Bias in Schools, a developmental approach to exploring race and racism, which is an amazing read. It will transform you and the way you think, and it will help you take your next steps in doing this very important work. And we're really just so privileged to have Dr. Benson with us a second time. And just a little additional note, just publicly thank him because he's agreed to, Nick and I, since last we spoke, have become instructors on the collegiate level, and Dr. Benson has been kind enough to come on in and talk to our students, and they're going to be reading Unconscious Bias in Schools as well. So we're going to get to continue the conversation even further with our students in our class, and they're going to be absolutely blown away by everything that you bring to the table. So thank you, a million thank yous, and we're really just so happy to have you.
Well, thank you, Nick and Marc. I appreciate you, one, for buying my book and assigning it to your class, having me on your show. You guys are an absolute joy for me to talk to. I could talk to you also for the next few hours, and I think we will continue to have a great discussion. But I look forward to coming visiting you and your students at your university placement. And again, thank you for your time, and hope to be back at some point in time in the future.
Thank you very much.